A couple of months ago, my girlfriend and I took a trip to England and Iceland. Originally, we were just going to go to England for the Brighton Festival, where we saw over a dozen shows, but because Iceland offers cheap flights, we stopped by for an extended layover on the way back. On the first day, we went to the hot springs spa, and on the second day, we took a driving tour of the south coast. The tour itself was very nice. The driver was entertaining, the bus was comfortable, the stops were beautiful, and the food was delicious. The company was the reason I'm now making this video. The other passengers were, with few exceptions, rude and ridiculous. I thought I knew the meaning of the ugly American before this trip. They're uncultured, uninterested in the world, think that the USA is the center of the universe, ill-mannered, probably Southern, let's be real, and of course, grossly overweight. I've put a considerable amount of energy into not being that, but it wasn't until this trip that I realized I had been trying to distance myself from something that wasn't even real. The ugly American isn't about body type or how well dressed or well traveled you are. I'd always thought that was what it was, but it's not. It's the attitude of thinking that you're the most important person in the room, that you know best and know the most. It's the assumption that you know how to live and everyone else can learn something from your wisdom. It's the inability to humble yourself and experience another way of life and, God forbid, learn something while you're there. The Southern Coast tour was 12 hours, so I got the opportunity to really study some such specimens. Here's a compilation of what I witnessed. First, just because you're Canadian doesn't mean you're not an ugly American. Ugly American is an attitude and an archetype, not a nationality, and you don't need to be a citizen of the United States to be one. One of the standout characters on the bus was a guy from Vancouver. He was middle-aged and well-heeled, traveling with his wife. When I first met him, he was polite enough to me. He introduced himself, asked me where I was from, and asked if it was confusing for Americans to have Washington the state near where he lived, and Washington the capital where I live. I noticed the ugly American in him start to flare up when we got to the glacier, and he commented to his wife that maybe glaciers are interesting to some people. Sir, I live below Mason and Dixon's line. We don't have them where I live, and I've never before seen one that was so large and so close. Of course, I didn't say this, I just filed it away for the video I'm making now. Oh, and glaciers are cool. I'm sorry he's trotted so much globe that he's tired of looking at glaciers, but the big thing this guy did was actually the cruelest thing I saw on the whole trip. I didn't enjoy seeing it, and I wish it hadn't happened. He asked the tour guide to talk about how Iceland weathered and recovered from the 2008 recession. I didn't know this story before our guide told it, but basically, the recession hit Iceland particularly hard. Industries collapsed and the value of the krona halved. That sounds terrifying. I would be so sad and scared if that happened to me and my community. But this guy from Vancouver had clearly heard the story before. He prompted the guy to get on with the recovery part of the story, in which his big Canadian tourist dollars could be framed as the hero. Just as the tour guide was beginning to talk about the growth of the tourism industry, he twisted the knife by gloating about how great a deal it had been right after the crash to come to Iceland for half-price vacations. Yeah, dude. The guy was just telling us about how the national economy was devastated, and I'm guessing his friends and family were all impacted by it. But okay, let's talk about the cheap vacations you took while other people were struggling to get back on their feet. It's really classy. Of course, plenty of ugly Americans are American. One woman got really hung up on the fact that Icelandic as a language couldn't possibly be dying, despite the tour guide trying to explain to her the problem. It was like she couldn't or wouldn't wrap her mind around it. She kept asking if everyone in Iceland spoke it, and when the guide said yes, everyone in Iceland speaks Icelandic and many immigrants did too, she insisted that that should mean that it wasn't dying. She spent the rest of the tour asking to learn individual words in Icelandic, which she couldn't pronounce because there were whole mouth shapes that we don't have in English. Anyway, I did a quick Google and I found an article, link in the description, explaining that pressure from foreigners who need to default to English before becoming conversational in Icelandic or choosing to continue in English rather than learning Icelandic could lead to a more general tendency to default to English in all or some areas of life and industry, which would erode the importance and use of Icelandic. There, that's not too hard. It's only hard to grasp when you don't bother to humble yourself enough to learn about someone else's way of life or point of view. Speaking of ways of life, did you know that legal marriage is take it or leave it in Iceland? According to our guide, a considerable portion of people don't bother marrying at all in the legal sense. How do we get on this topic, you ask? Well, one of the tourists was complaining about how American marriage rates were declining and how nobody bothers to get married anymore because women don't want husbands, just baby daddies. He then began to lecture the guide about the problem with single parents who spend all their money in Las Vegas and leave their kids alone in terrible apartments all day. Then his piece of fiction took a strange turn. I actually wrote this down when we got back to the hotel because it's so much. When you hear about the jihadists embedding themselves in American culture, then they go to Las Vegas and they say death to Americans, that's why. Sir, that's not why the jihadists hate America. That's why you hate America. Why are we dragging the jihadists into this? Even if that was why they hate America, then what? Are you suggesting that the terrorists are simply correct and the answer is to change our society, culture, and way of life to mirror theirs? Hey everyone, we have a jihadist sympathizer among us. He doesn't know it, but he is. You don't have to be a jihadist sympathizer to disapprove of Las Vegas, but he's the one who brought them into this and leveraged their hatred of America to bolster his value judgment. Our tour guide was such a professional about this too, just smiling and quietly letting the guy tire himself out. This approach also served him well with another notable passenger, a man from Boston who would not shut up about all the places he'd been. He kept bragging about having been to a little bit of everywhere in the kind of way that felt forced and gauche. There's a saying I like, money can't buy you class. There are obvious problems with it, including the fact that a lot of old money mannerisms exist and perpetuate, in part, to exclude new money. Think Elle Woods at Harvard. Where was I? Oh, right. This guy in his travels. Clearly he had money but not class because every other thing he said was a reference to how much he had traveled as a way to indicate how worldly and cultured he was. In particular, two comments stood out to me. At one point, he was explaining how he'd taken off several weeks at once to travel throughout Europe. The way he said it was like, most people would take 2 vacations, but we're saving money by flying here at once and then just staying for 2 vacations back to back. At this, I turned to my fiancé and asked, most people? Does he think most people take 2 international trips a year? Most people don't get to travel internationally. Most people are living paycheck to paycheck. As for saving money, this guy really thinks that a 3-week European vacation is the way to save money. Yeah, maybe compared to 2 week-and-a-half European vacations, but it's ridiculous to act like what he's doing is thrifty. Later he was talking with our guide and having him explain some convention of Icelandic culture, and just as it clicked for him, he pivoted, as so many well-traveled people do, from learning to explaining. He was like, oh, that reminds me of this thing in Germany, and started explaining the minutiae of that thing to the guide. Now, I understand this impulse because I've been a teenager. You want to show off that you understand and confirm that your understanding is correct. But this guy was like 50, and he wasn't just confirming with the guide that he understood, but also showing off the context in which he understood as a brag in and of itself. Look how knowledgeable I am. I'm not just your average tourist. I'm a world traveler who picks up things everywhere I go. Honestly, the driver was so professional about this lecture. He just quietly nodded along and let the guy talk himself out again. If it was me, and I know this because I used to work in tourism, if it had been me, I would have said something to deflate him like, yeah, see? You're getting the hang of it. You'll be a native speaker in no time. Just really take the wind out of his sails by congratulating his little learning moment the way one would a child's little learning moment, and not even acknowledging the fact that he tried to flip the script and turn me into his student. I didn't do it often, but it was a really useful tool to have when older men tried to undermine my 22-year-old self and hijack my tours. This guy didn't do anything like that. He was very mellow, and I just thought about how many times a week he must have the same types on every tour. Somebody who tries to learn Icelandic, someone who gets weird about the fact that marriage isn't the cultural default, someone who tries to position himself as the best traveler in the group, someone who thinks they're thrifty while on an international vacation, someone who insults his work to his face. I saved the most insulting comment someone made for last. I've gathered that when you travel to Iceland, you either go to the west side or the east side. Then you go on any number of day-long driving tours to see the natural beauty. The tour we went on was the Southern Coast Tour, which includes glaciers, black sand beaches, cliffs, horses, puffin spotting spots. I had a really nice time, but it wasn't for everyone. One woman got a bit fidgety by the midpoint and asked our guide which tour was his favorite to give. He said the Southern Coast Tour was his favorite, and she responded, "That's what my guide yesterday said, but I don't know why," to the man who was giving her the tour. I learned from a young age that being the ugly American overseas was the worst thing you could be. My whole life, I thought that all Americans were the ugly American, and that as soon as we showed up in another country, we had some kind of tell about us that made us innately awful. You know, we eat too much, we wear sneakers instead of shoes, we talk and laugh too loudly. These things might be annoying to some people, but they are nothing compared to this attitude of superiority I witnessed in Iceland. That's the ugly American. And after years of hearing about this aesthetics-based ugly American, I think it's time to talk about what's lurking underneath because, well, it's not pretty.